Hi guys, and welcome to Tutes Online. Today I'm going to take you through the skull. So there's our outline. There's one orbit. There's another orbit. Just above the orbits there's a foramen or a notch, and this is called the supraorbital notch or supraorbital foramen. Just underneath, on the maxillary bone, you have another foramen called the infraorbital foramen. Here I'll draw the two nasal bones, and this here is the piriform aperture. Just finish our frontal bone off. So this space here, that is the frontal bone. Making up the edge of the orbit are the two zygomatic bones. And here is the rest of the maxilla, which leaves this bit as the mandible. And on the mandible you have another two foramen called the mental foramen. Up here, where the teeth are, is the alveolar process. One of the maxilla and one of the mandible. Okay, so we've got your orbits, your piriform aperture, nasal bone, maxillary bone, zygomatic bone, frontal bone, mandible, infraorbital foramen, supraorbital foramen, mental foramen, alveolar process. Okay, so now that we have gone through front of the skull, let us look at the side of the skull. Just drawing the outline. Teeth. Here we have the frontal bone, just here. Right here, this here is your nasal bone. Coming down under orbit, this bone here is the zygomatic bone, which makes until this line here, this is your maxilla. Down here we have the mandible. Okay, moving backwards. Right here is the greater wing of the sphenoid, which is a bone that you can see. It's more inside the skull and it makes up the floor of the skull. Moving back even more, on the posterior of the head we have the occipital bone. Coming across here, this is the parietal bone on the superior part of the skull, and here is the temporal bone. Okay, so what features can we see? Well, on the zygomatic bone, there's a foramen here, which is called the zygomaticofacial foramen, and down here we have our mental foramen. Here, this is the external acoustic meatus. Here, part of the temporal bone is the mastoid process. And this here, again, part of the temporal bone, is the styloid process. Up here, on the temporal bone, we have the temporal fossa, and in between this sphenoid bone and the zygomatic arch, in between the zygomatic arch and this bone, sphenoid bone, is the infraorbital fossa. Just in there. So those are the main features of the side of the skull. Now we'll look at the superior aspect of the skull, just so we can have a look at some sutures. So here's a suture, here's another suture, here's another one. This is the frontal bone. This here is a parietal bone. And right here, you have the occipital bone. Okay. This suture is called the coronal suture. This suture is called the sagittal suture. Now remember, this is coronal, this is sagittal. And when you have to think about planes of the body, think about these two sutures, coronal suture and the sagittal suture, and you shouldn't get confused. This suture you can't really see on the top, I've just drawn it in just so you get an idea. But when you look at the posterior aspect of the skull, you definitely can see it. So let's take a look at the posterior of the skull. bone there, bone there. So this was that V suture we saw before. And this is called the lambdoidal suture. And it separates two parietal bones from the occipital bone. So it's called the lambdoidal suture because it looks like the lambda symbol. These two bones here are the temporal bones, and these sutures are the squamous sutures. And this little bit of suture here is part of the sagittal suture, separating the two parietal bones from each other. Okay, let's move on. We'll do some internal features now. So let's look at the frontal bone, and we'll look at the anterior cranial fossa to be exact, which is a fossa on the inside of the skull. What I'm drawing here to the two frontal sinuses. Okay, this frontal sinuses are within the frontal bone. Then we have the ethmoid bone, and there's a little bit that sticks up. That part that sticks up in bold, that's called the crista galli, and part of the falx cerebri attaches to this here on the ethmoid bone. On the side, you've got this little bit, this area of holes, small holes, and that's called the cribriform plate, and that's where all those nasal cells project through to get to the olfactory bulbs. Coming back from behind the ethmoid, you've got part of the sphenoid bone. Here is the lesser wing of the sphenoid. So remember we saw the greater wing on the outside of the skull? This is the lesser wing. And down here, that is the orbital plate of the frontal bone. So that is the anterior cranial fossa. Now we'll move on to the middle cranial fossa. We have sort of bat or bird or butterfly shape. So here and here, these are called the anterior clinoid processes, and they're part of that sphenoid bone, the lesser wings. Okay, we've got a lot of foramina in this fossa, and a lot of features, lots of features. So let's start off in the middle here. So depression, just here, called the hypophyseal fossa. And that is for the pituitary. Coming around you have your superior orbital fissure. And this is for the oculomotor nerve, the trochlear nerve, the ophthalmic and division of the trigeminal, and the abducent nerve. This is all going to your orbit. Okay, moving a bit more posteriorly. The next foramen is called foramen rotundum. And foramen rotundum is for the maxillary nerve. Okay, moving on. You've got another foramen called foramen ovale. And foramen ovale is for the mandibular nerve. So let's quickly go over what we've learnt so far. We've got the orbital canal for the optic nerve. We have the superior orbital fissure, and that contains the oculomotor nerve, the trochlear nerve, the ophthalmic division of the trigeminal, and the abducent nerve. Then we have foramen rotundum, and that's for the maxillary nerve. And then we have foramen ovale, which is for the mandibular nerve. The next one is a small little foramen called foramen spinosum, and that is not for a nerve, it's for an artery. It's for the middle meningeal artery. And then there's one more, a very lacerated foramen up the back. And this one is called foramen lacerum. And it has a few things. It's got the greater petrosal nerve, and it has the internal carotid artery as well coming through. Okay, a few more features that we need to know. Just next to, about here, next to foramen lacerum, we have the trigeminal impression. And this is an impression left on the skull by the trigeminal nerve, which branches off into ophthalmic, maxillary, and mandibular nerves. Moving posterior to the trigeminal impression, we have an elevated area called the arcuate eminence. And the arcuate eminence overlies the semicircular canals of the inner ear. Just anterior to this, right about here, we have tegmen tympani. And tegmen tympani overlies the middle ear. So you have inner ear, middle ear. Just one more feature for the middle cranial fossa. Little projection here. And this has the posterior clinoid processes. So here's your anterior clinoid processes. Here are the posterior clinoid processes. And that is the middle cranial fossa. So, we move on to the posterior cranial fossa. Okay, so here is where that projection was with the posterior clinoid processes. And there's a bit that dips. This is called the clivus. Then we have some more foramen. We've got a giant foramen. This is called foramen magnum. So then we have a little foramen next to that, and that's called the hypoglossal canal. And this is for the hypoglossal nerve. Next to this, we've got another big foramen. It's called the jugular foramen. And the jugular foramen has the glossopharyngeal nerve, the vagus nerve, and the accessory nerve going through it, as well as the jugular veins, the internal jugular veins. And then just lateral to this, we have the internal acoustic meatus. And through the internal acoustic meatus, this is how our vestibulocochlear nerve enters into the inner ear. And that is the posterior cranial fossa. Now, we're going to look at the bottom of the skull now. So this is just taking the skull and turning it over to see the bottom of the skull. So an exterior view. Okay, so what I've drawn here is the palatine process of the maxilla. Posterior to this are the palatine bones. There's a foramen here called the incisive canal. And here we have the lesser and greater palatine foramen for the greater and lesser palatine nerves. So moving back, we have the medial pterygoid process and the lateral pterygoid process. Here and here are the zygomatic arches. Here's your foramen magnum again, from the external side. And right next to it we have the occipital condyles. Which articulate with the atlas, the first cervical vertebra. We've got the articular fossa the mandible. Then behind that is a fissure called the petrotympanic fissure. And then we have the styloid process. Then the mastoid process. And medial to the mastoid process is a notch called the mastoid notch, or the digastric notch. And that's for the digastric muscle. There are a few more features just here in the middle. A little bump here called the pharyngeal tubercle, for attachment of the pharyngeal muscles. These here, this is the nasal septum in the middle, and these are the choanae. Posterior to the choanae, we have the palatopharyngeal canal, just a small little hole there. Posterior to the medial pterygoid process, just at the bottom, we have the pterygoid canal. So here we have the palatopharyngeal canal, and here we have the pterygoid canal. Okay, so you know how we saw those foramen in the middle cranial fossa from the inside? Well, you can see them from the outside as well. And they're just about here, along this line here. So the first one, foramen ovale. Then you have foramen spinosum. You can't see foramen rotundum from the bottom of the skull because of its angle, but it's here. So we've got ovale, spinosum. Then we have lacerum. And then we have the jugular foramen. And just between the styloid process and the mastoid process, we have the stylomastoid foramen. Okay, let's move on. Let's do some orbit. So here's our orbit. We're going to say that this is lateral. This is medial. So this is closer to the nose. This is closer to the ear. You have the lacrimal bone here. You have your frontal bone here. You have your zygomatic bone just there. Down the bottom here, you have your maxilla, making up the floor of the orbit. Coming in here, you have the sphenoid bone, which leaves this space as the ethmoid bone. Here we have two holes called the anterior and posterior ethmoid canals. Moving across, you have the optic canal and the superior orbital fissure. Down here, you have the inferior orbital fissure. So that's the orbit. Just learn some features of the mandible while we finish up. Okay, this is here, this bit that articulates with this rest of the skull. This is called the condyle. Mandibular condyle, if you want to be more specific. This here is called the mastoid notch. And this is called the coronoid process. So you've got condyle, mastoid notch, coronoid process. Here, where the teeth are, here we have the alveolar process. Alveolar process. We have our mental foramen. This bulk of the mandible is referred to as the body of the mandible. This curve here is referred to as the angle of the mandible. This part, the ascending part, is called the ramus of the mandible. And this here is called the neck of the condyle of the mandible. So that's our external surface. Let's draw an internal surface now. So there are some features on the inside which are of particular interest. Draw it the other way so we don't get confused. Okay, you got your condyle, your coronoid process, mastoid notch. Coming down here, you have a hook. This hook bit is called the lingula. And then you have a foramen just underneath. And this one is called the mandibular foramen. So the foramen that's on the outside is called the mental foramen. And the foramen that is on the inside is called the mandibular foramen. Then we have a line going this way and a groove. The line is called the mylohyoid line and is for attachment of muscle. The groove is called the mylohyoid groove and is for passage of vessels. Above the mylohyoid line, you have the sublingual fossa. Above the mylohyoid line is the sublingual fossa. Below the mylohyoid line is the submandibular fossa. Above the line, sublingual. Below the line, submandibular. Here, just on the inside, you have a fossa. This is sort of on the anterior internal aspect. We have a fossa called the digastric fossa, and that's for attachment of the digastric muscles. And you can't really see it from this view, but I will show you. We're looking internally from above. So we're looking down on it, we're looking at the internal part of the mandible. Here we have the mental spine. Okay, and that wraps it up for the skull. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. Make sure you come back and learn a bit more about the human body. Thanks, and I'll see you soon.